All right, I guess we can get started. It's five after. I was trying to give people time to trickle in, but we'll go on and get started. First, let me introduce myself. First, let me welcome you to the class. Thank you guys for taking the time out to join the CompTIA Security Plus class. Our goal here is to, provide you with the concepts and the terms and the education that you need to, not only pass the CompTIA Security Plus exam, but to give you that foundation of uh, what it takes to be in this cybersecurity field. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with CompTIA, but CompTIA is one of it's a global recognized certification partner or provider. And this type of certification, especially the Security Plus and Security Analyst, as you go up the ladder, but these are globally recognized certifications. So another key point too is when you're dealing with the government, the U.S. government, they actually require for any entry level security jobs per se, they actually require the Security Plus certification. So this certification carries a lot of weight in this industry. So hope you guys are excited to go on this journey. And me myself, my name is Dwayne Viers. I'm gonna be your instructor for tonight. I've been in the IT industry for quite some time. I'm gonna give my age here, but I go way back to Windows Windows 3.1 DOS is when I first started messing with computer systems. I've worn many hats in my career. I had probably close to a 30 plus year career in IT as an adult, really, besides delivering pizzas when I was younger. This is really the only job I've had as an adult has been in technology. So, um, minus my military experience. That's why I first kind of came into it is when I was in the military. So yeah, that's about me. My last position, I was a director at a global company. I was the IT direct, not the IT, but I was a specific program director. So I had a few managers. I had teams that were based all around the world, and we dealt with loyalty and payment systems. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with Shell gas station, but that fuel rewards program, that was one of the programs that I supported. So anytime they had issues with any of those um, programs, they would call into my teams around the world. So enough about me. Um, so are you new to the industry? Just, as by a show of hands, you guys could, raise your hands if you like. I just want to kind of get an idea. Are you guys in the industry already? Are you new? Are you changing careers? Just kind of type me a chat and let me know. That way I kind of get a feel for my audience so I can know how to tailor the information and make sure that you guys are understanding. So um, if you have experience before, just you can raise your hand. If you don't raise your hand, I guess that'll let me know that you don't have the experience. Are you guys in cybersecurity already? Are you looking to change careers? Um, Anybody could jump in if you would like. Or me, I'm an interactive type of guy, so I like to call people out. So I may call a few names just to, make it interesting and hey, I see some people are in the industry and switching careers. Okay, a lot of you guys are new. Got it, got it. All right, that's good to know. Good to know. Let me share my screen. Can you guys see my screen? Well, it's popping up now for a second. Got to bear with me a little bit. I lost my computer yesterday actually, so I had to go buy another laptop, and I've been setting it up for the last couple of days. And I usually have my camera on so you can see my face, but for some reason my camera's not working, so we'll make it work though. All right. So talking about cybersecurity, a lot of people, throw that term around, just say cybersecurity, but there's a lot of different avenues when you talk about cybersecurity. There's a piece of it where, you can do governance, risk and compliance. There's an analyst aspect of it. So as we go through this course, we'll start to call out some of the career paths that you guys could take as you embark on this new journey. Because cybersecurity is just like saying I'm a doctor, right? You got different types of doctors. You got cardiologists, you got ophthalmologists, you got general medicine. You got all different types of specialties, and that kind of falls true for information security or what they call cybersecurity. So what we're going to talk about now is really the foundation of really what cybersecurity is, right? So when you talk about cybersecurity, the goal of cybersecurity is really to protect data, or in a more generalized term, we're talking about information security, right? So information security basically refers to the protection of data resources from unauthorized access. So you want the good people to be able to access the data, and you want to keep the bad guys out. Um, Over the course of time, if you think back a few years ago, cybersecurity was a thing, but it wasn't at the forefront of everybody's agenda, or everybody's um, topics. But over the years, as the threat actors emerge, and I'll throw some terms out there, and we'll talk more about them as we go through the course. But it it can get real advanced, right? You got something as simple as what they call a script kiddie, right? A script kiddie, these are all different threat actors, right? That's a term that you're gonna get familiar with, and make sure I'm gonna give you guys hints when there's exam topics. I'm gonna kind of reiterate those subjects because these are definitely concepts and topics that you will see on the exam, right? So it gets a basic at something like a script kiddie. These are guys who don't really know much about programming or development. They just basically go in the dark web, or they go find tools that are already out there, and they basically try to hack into systems. And then the flip side of that is when you get to nation states, like you got nations that employ armies of hackers, and they try to hack everything from financial institutions to infrastructure institutions like energy grids and things like that. So you can see um, how this is a big thing. And now that you're talking about artificial intelligence, you talk about cloud computing, all these things are really, giving us exposure, or giving our data exposure in a lot of different ways into many, many different people, so to speak. I don't know if you guys stay um, in the know as far as the news, but over the last couple of years, there's been significant data breaches. I know Sony PlayStation got hacked a few years ago. Cash App got hacked. Even the credit bureaus, they've even been hacked. So we like to say in the industry is not a matter of if you get hacked. It's just basically a matter of when, because you have another threat actor, what they call persistent threats. These are the people who have the time, and all they do is focus on ways to break into your system, and eventually they're going to get there. And as we go through, you'll kind of understand why. There's terms about we'll call 0 day. That may not mean anything to you right now in the beginning, but as we go through the course, these concepts and these terms will start to come to life. So at its foundation, and this is something that you need to pay attention to, because you will see questions around this on the exam, right? So in this basic state, what we're trying to do as a cybersecurity professional is like we said, you're trying to protect data, right? The things that you're trying to protect is what we call the CIA triad, right? So just picture a triangle, right? Picture a triangle, and at the top, or each point, you know, each point is a term in this triad, right? So confidentiality, integrity, and availability. That's the CIA triad. Remember that, because you'll see that on the test. It's kind of, it's a little bit easier to remember because you can kind of reference it to, there is a thing called the CIA, which is the Central Intelligence Agency, not to get confused with the CIA triad of cybersecurity, which outlines confidentiality, integrity, and availability. That is the fundamental foundation of what cybersecurity is really all about. You want to make sure that the data that you're protecting is confidential, right? That means that the information can only be read by people who you've given that authorization to access it, right? So integrity. That means that the data that is stored or transferred There's no modification or, that nobody has manipulated this data. The integrity of that data is still there. And then availability. And that's kind of self-explanatory. That really means that the data that you have or the data that you're protecting is available for the people who need it. So the CIA triad is the foundation of cybersecurity. CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So a little bit more about that, right? So when you're talking about data that you're protecting, right? Data is in about it's at three different states. So when you have data, right, you either store data, so you have it stored, on your computers, or you have it stored in a database somewhere. That's what we consider data at rest. So that data is not being used; it's just stored somewhere, and that's a target. Like, you got bad actors that's going to try to target that data because it's stored data. It could be anything from what they call PII, which is personal identification information. That's like your name, phone number, address, driver's license numbers, credit card numbers, any type of data that can be used to identify a person, right? So we want to keep that data that's at rest. We want to protect that data. So the different states is data that is at rest. You got data that's in use. You're actively using this data, and then you got data in transit, meaning that you're sending the data somewhere. Like, for example, when you type a text or you type an email, right? You're typing up your email, and once you hit send, it goes through the network and does all the things that it does, and then it sends it over an encrypted. Hopefully, it's an encrypted channel. So that's data that's in transit. And data that's in transit is a target as well, because you got bad actors that are trying to intercept that data to figure out or try to get some valuable information, to get passwords, usernames, things of that sort, to be able to use it to break into your systems. So data at rest, that's stored data. Data in use is data that you're currently using, and then you got data in transit. So we have to find ways, us as security professionals, we have to find ways to be able to protect the data when it's in all three of those different states, right? And one of the things based on the CIA triad is the confidentiality piece, and we'll get more into that as we go. Confidentiality gets into a lot of the encryption, things of that sort. So just remember, the CIA triad is the foundation of what cybersecurity really is. Um, there's another concept called non-repudiation, right? So non-repudiation means basically that the data came from the person that they said it came from, and it can't be manipulated, and you can't deny it, right? And there are ways to be able to achieve non-repudiation, and we'll get into that too. One of those methods is called hashing, and we'll talk about hashing in a couple of the later chapters, but I'm just kind of throwing these terms out here now, so as we get deeper into this material and we start to throw out some terms, they'll kind of come back to you and you'll start to understand what they mean. But non-repudiation, it just means that a person cannot deny doing something. So if I say I sent this message to Brandon, right? Once Brandon gets it, then I say, well, I didn't send that email to Brandon. Non-repudiation prevents that, because there's a way, and we'll, like I said, I keep saying this, but it's true. Um, there are ways to be able to achieve non-repudiation. There's methods, hashing, there's uh, digital signatures, things of that sort, where you can tell that this data came from who they said it came from. And that's important too when you think about, like, when you're online downloading software, right? You should probably get familiar with these things, because it's probably practices and what we like to call good cybersecurity hygiene, right? The good cybersecurity hygiene is just really your everyday practices of how you look at security and how you look at cybersecurity. Because, like, now, just let's face it, like, everything we do is using technology. Our phones are more powerful than ever. Like, probably every one of us have your banking information on your phone. You log into your emails. You may have your other accounts, your car notes, credit cards, all these different things you access over your phone. And you're not really thinking that you got bad actors that are banking on you to make mistakes so they can access that data. So now it's like changing your mind state of how you think about things that you do every day. But non-repudiation is just, it's really like a digital signature. So it just identifies and say that, hey, this came from the person that it said it came from. It was signed and it hasn't been tampered with. So that's another term. So get familiar with these terms. Confidentiality, integrity, availability, which is the CIA triad, which is the foundation. This is everything that we're going to talk about going forward is going to be based on these three things: confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and non-repudiation. So get familiar with those terms. Even after this course, if you want to go back and put it in Chat GPT to get a better explanation of what it is and what it means as it relates to cybersecurity, I encourage that because this is just one method of giving you the information. Of course, you know, uh, being in the game as long as I've been in it, this is a continuing thing. Like you basically never stop learning. There's always something new that's coming. There's always something else to learn. So it's like, you go on this lifelong journey of just learning information. Any questions thus far? Everybody understand that concept with the CIA triad and non-repudiation? All right, I'm gonna see if y'all were paying attention. Somebody tell me, what are the three states that you find data in? We mentioned there are three states. Can anybody name what those three states were? Now you can turn on your mic and just, we don't have to be too formal. So if you want to turn on your mic and just blurt it out, that's cool.
At rest, in use, and in transit.
There you go. Bam. Good job. Data that's in use, it's at rest, it's in use, and in transit. That is what we're trying to protect. Now, when you talk about cybersecurity, another thing is the framework, right? So, like when you go into an organization, like now, most of the time when we're talking about organizations, a lot of the organizations already have their framework. It's very rare unless you go to a startup or something like that. It's very rare that you're going to have to go in and design a whole security framework from scratch. But in the event that you do, there are frameworks out there that you can use, right? So you don't have to just go into an organization and just say, man, we need to create this security framework. Where do we even begin? That's where these frameworks come in. And it's basically like, like a house, right? You got the blueprint. Like you can't, if you've never built a house before, it wouldn't be wise to just, go buy some wood and just start building blocks, things like that. You got to look at the blueprint, you got to create the frame, you got to do all these things before you start building. That's the same thing when we're talking about cybersecurity. And there are frameworks out there already to kind of give you a head start. Now, one of the institutes or this is called NIST, right? National Institute of Standard and Technology. That is one of the go-to or the number one standards organization that's out there. So a lot of cybersecurity frameworks are based on what they call the NIST standard, right? That is a government organization, and they're basically the end all be all of cybersecurity. So whatever standard that they set, everybody else have to adopt to what they say. Like how to like when we talked about the data at rest, right? NIST comes up with a framework of how you protect the data at rest, the data that's in use. They come up with a framework and a standard of how you should protect the data in use and how you should protect the data that's in transit. So they write a bunch of white papers. They have the standards, they have the frameworks. So if you get time, go to NIST.gov and just kind of look around their website. It is invaluable information that you can gather just kind of browsing on the website because, like I said, NIST is the end all be all when it comes to cybersecurity. Everything that we do in the industry is based off of the standards that the National Institute of Standards and Technology creates, and especially when you're dealing with the government. So when you talk about frameworks and you talk about NIST, their framework is really based off of five functions. right? Everything that they do are now it's a lot more to it than this. This is like the highest level, right? This is at the highest level. These are the functions that you would use or you would start to um, create when you're talking about a security framework or when you're creating a security architecture in your organization, or even if you go into a company that already has it, you know, if you are familiar with NIST, you're ahead of the game and you can come in and you can be like, hey, you can probably make some recommendations and, you know, get some brownie points with your boss or whoever, you're working for, because, if you understand this, you understand, cybersecurity and the frameworks and all the things that go into it. But at its highest level, there are 5 functions when it comes to this framework: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover, right? These are the 5 functions. Now, within these functions, there are many, 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 many controls that you can do to achieve that. But in its highest form, these are the 5 functions that you want to um, cover or make sure that you have covered when you're talking about a cybersecurity framework. So we talk about identify, right? Identify is developing security policies and capabilities, evaluating risks, threats, vulnerabilities, and then you recommend the controls to mitigate those risks. So when you identify, so let me take a step back a second. So in order to secure something, you got to know what it is that you're securing, right? You can't just go in there and say, I'm just going to secure the data. If you don't know what type of data it is, where this data is stored, how it's sent, all the devices that is used to transmit and store this data. So when you're talking about identifying, you have to do what they call basically a inventory, right? You want to know everything about your environment. You want to know, where they are in the food chain. Like if you're talking about financial organizations, you got to know all the different SOC and PCI um, audits that they may have to undergo. So you have to understand everything about your environment, not only the data, but the hardware. You want to know about the people, the access that individuals have. So you have to identify all these different things so you can make sure that you're having the correct protect that data. And you can't do that if you don't know what you're working with. So identify is a very important step. So you have to identify security policies, and we'll get into that a little bit later too. Um, and the next thing is talking about protection. To protect the data. That doesn't start like with the data that's already generated. That's a part of it, but it starts when you initially, procure, if you're buying a firewall, for example, if you're a server, if you got developers in your organizations that are developing applications, security starts in the very beginning. And in the past, there wasn't a big push to really look at the security posture. People didn't protecting data or cybersecurity until it was too late, right? Most people was like, oh, we're good until you're not, right? Until you have a breach and now you're on the hook. And then depending on what industry you're in, when you have these breaches, that can get real expensive. Like there may be fines that may be levied against you because these things that we're talking about, identify, protect, and detect, confidentiality, integrity, availability, those things you didn't take into consideration. You had a breach, you exposed you expose your customer data, and now you're on the hook. And those fines could get into the millions and millions of dollars. So protection starts from the time, like for example, let me give you another real life example. Like if you buy a firewall, say you go purchase a firewall, right? There are certain things that you have to do to that firewall before you put it into production. You want to harden that firewall. You want to take all the unnecessary uh, things that are on there that's not needed. You want to remove those. You want to make sure that the software is up to date, everything is patched. You take off the default passwords. Routers and servers, a lot of times they come with an administrator account, and a lot of times they have an administrator password. The Not just us as security professionals, but the bad actors know this as well, right? And they bank on on you making these mistakes or overlooking these things so they can access your systems. You know, um, today, I'm not sure if you guys know, but the number one um, reason why a lot of these companies get breached is usually through, say, I'm from the IRS, you've been, whatever. They try to scare you into clicking on something, right? And once you click on it, there are a whole, and we'll talk about those, as we go through and we talk about the different types of threats. But you can click on something and not realize that you just gave a backdoor entry to somebody into your organization or into your company's network. A few years ago, um, and that brings me to my next point: detection. That's a very important step too, because a few years ago, the average amount of time that a bad actor had breached your system and was in your network without you knowing was like 14 days. So that's almost 2 weeks. So a bad actor is able to infiltrate your system, get in there, and he's in there for almost 2 weeks before you even know that they're in there. So do you understand how much damage or how much information a person can access or do within 14 days? And that's before you even notice it that something is amiss. So detection is another part. That's that's a very important part. Not only detection, but do ongoing monitoring, proactive monitoring, looking at your controls, reevaluating your controls to see how effective they are at trying to prevent a bad actor from breaching your systems. And like I said, even the best of them, even our governments have been breached. A lot of our colleges, there's not an industry pro. Is that feedback for me? That was kind of weird. I heard. Hold on, why is that feedback coming? Do y'all hear that feedback? It's me. All right, let me go on. So detection, like I said, detection is a real big piece of it because you got to detect that the bad actors are there to be able to contain them. And then, like I said, you want to do proactive monitoring. There's a lot of tools. We'll talk about intrusion detection systems, intrusion prevention systems. You got next gen firewalls. You got isolated network systems. You got VLAN. There's a lot of ways to design your networks to make it easier for you to detect. And then one way too, like when you talk about the detection, right? What makes it easier, and a lot of people look over this, right? So whenever you go to your organization, what you really want to do is like you want to get a baseline. You want to have a baseline or understanding of what does a normal day look like on your network? What applications are running? What processes are running? Is it certain times of day that things are busier than others? You know, who, what area, what geographic location people are logging into your network from. So one of the things that you really want to do is get a baseline, right? You want a baseline to see what a normal environment looks like, and you have that, right? So you have that baseline. So if something does look amiss, you can compare it to your baseline. If your baseline is, you know, so many users or so many process normally runs, and now you see there's a extra 50 or to 100 different processes running that you're not aware of, that's something that should be investigated because it's out of the ordinary. So really, when you're talking about detection and you're talking about threat hunting and things like that, you're basically looking for things that's out of the ordinary, like certain processes that are running that shouldn't be, things that look suspicious, like where certain files access that, from a weird location, like why are they accessing these files? So detection is real important. And then responding is I can't emphasize that enough. To identify, analyze, and contain, right? So you have to respond. Once it's detected, you have to respond. You got to identify what that threat is, analyze what kind of damage or what vulnerabilities it is, and then be able to contain it. So it can't continue to do damage, right? There was a breach a few years ago. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with it, but there was a breach at Target, right? And the way that they got into Target was that through their HVAC system, right? The HVAC system, and I'm not sure who designed this, but if it was me, they would have been fired on the spot. Their HVAC system was on the same network that their registers, their cash registers were. So the bad actors was able to infiltrate their supply chain by hacking their HVAC system. And once they got into the HVAC system, they were able to access the network where all their cash registers were. So they were able to access credit card, personal information for weeks before Target even knew that there was a data breach. And that was a pretty large one. I think it was a couple of years ago. And as you start to get into your career and start becoming aware of cybersecurity terms and things of that sort, you'll start to pay a little bit more attention and you'll see things and you'll be like, man, and the reason why the government is really right now is really making a big push is because all of our systems have been hacked. Like we got countries that are, they deploy hundreds and thousands of hackers to just sit there and constantly try to infiltrate our system. So, us in America, we're the front lines to be able to protect those systems. So identifying, protection, detecting, responding, and then recovering, right? There's a recovery process. And we'll get more into that too about, redundant systems, backups, things of that sort. This is where backups, because are real important. Are you guys familiar with ransomware? There's a lot of ransomware attacks out there now. What they do is a bad actor, and I've seen this firsthand. My sister is she's on the board of directors for the National Payroll Association, which is a nonprofit, right? And they're not, they don't have a lot of money, but they got hit with a ransomware attack and they had to pay $250,000 to get their data released. And that, you can fault your security team for that because if you had backups, you had copies of that data and you would have been able to continue without having to pay the ransom. So usually a ransomware attack, what they like to do is they get into your system and they encrypt all your data. So let's say, you're a, a sales company or data is your gold mine where you got customer data and you need this data to be able to do business. If a ransomware attack hits you and they encrypt all your data, that basically brings your business to its knees and you only have one choice. If you don't have the proper controls or the proper recovery methods in place to restore those systems, then you're at the mercy of that ransomware attacker and you may have to pay what they're asking. And, it's not cheap. They're asking millions, in some cases, hundreds of thousands of dollars that you have to pay to get your data unencrypted. Does that make sense? Any questions on those five functions? Identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. They're kind of self-explanatory, but this is the basis of how you start to create your cybersecurity framework. You want to have all these five functions in mind, and then you build it out from there. So, you start with identifying. Remember, you look at what you have, what your capabilities are. You look at what your risks are, what the threats that are out there, and what vulnerabilities you have. So you take all these different things into consideration, and then you have to come up with the controls to be able to protect it. Any questions on any of that? Make sense to everybody? All right, we'll keep it moving. And then this is just another kind of a visual look at what we just talked about. Identify being at the top of the list. And then this is another thing too, like when you're talking about threats, you see this border right here, this first border identifies internal threats, right? That's what we call, these are the people. So not only as a cybersecurity professional, not only are you having to be aware of the external threats, people outside the company that's trying to break in, but you also have to be aware of internal threats. And a lot of times the internal threats are negligence. Really, it's not some are intentional. Don't get me wrong. You have some bad actors internal that can do some damage, but a lot of it is just unintentional, right? Like I said, you get an email. Hey, they find out like what they call social engineering, right? Like they may be able to access some data, find out that you like dogs or you like cats or you're a pet person. And then they craft an email talking about pets and it may catch your attention because you're a pet person. And then you click on something and voila, you just gave somebody access to your systems. And it wasn't intentional. It's just, you have to be aware of things like that. Now, they do have um, software now that can monitor those things, but with the emergence of artificial intelligence, man, it's getting harder to be able to detect. Like before, you could see these emails because they'll say the misspells will be there. They'll say something like, I work for, you know, this is from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It'll be wording that you can identify, or you will see that kind of gives you make you look twice and say, this looks suspicious, right? Put it in the fishbowl. But with the emergence of AI and with the advancements of artificial intelligence, those are getting harder and those fakes are getting harder and harder to detect. There's a concept in artificial intelligence called deep fake, right? And those deep fakes are getting better and better. Um, I don't want to get off track and talk about AI, but yeah, just know that now bad actors are using artificial intelligence to help them break into your system. So go figure, right? Any questions? No questions? Good deal. So gap analysis. Have you guys heard familiar with that term, gap analysis? A gap analysis is kind of like not kind of, but is what it says it is. What you're looking for is you're looking for gaps in your controls, right? Um, so one of the key functions, and this could be ongoing, but one of the key functions that you may have to do, or maybe your responsibility um, as a cybersecurity professional, is doing a gap analysis, right? So each security function is associated with the number of goals or outcomes. One outcome of the identified function is an inventory, right? We said you need to inventory the assets that you own or operate in the company to be able to know what you're protecting, right? And then those outcomes are achieved by implementing one or more security controls. And we'll get into security controls, here in a second. But security controls are important because these are the controls that you're putting into place to be able to protect your data. And you have different categories, right? I don't want to jump too far ahead. You got managerial controls, you got physical controls, you got deterrent controls. So we'll get into that here in a second. But the gap analysis is a process that you're going to undertake to find these gaps in your security posture, right? So you may think that, hey, we got a real nice cyber security hygiene, we got a real nice cybersecurity um, infrastructure, but you never did a gap analysis, so you don't know that you have some gaps, right? So one of the gaps could be that you're not patching your systems, your operating systems, or your applications on a regular basis, right? So if you don't patch these systems, the reason why they release patches or updates is because they find security flaws, a lot of security flaws, a lot of things that can give bad actors, they can vulnerabilities, I guess, vulnerabilities that bad actors can exploit to be able to access your systems, and you're not aware of it. So one of the things that you have to do is make sure that you got a good patch management system, right? So what a gap analysis is, and make sure you understand the concept of a gap analysis too, because you'll see that on the exam as well. But in its essence, it's just a process of you looking at all of your security architecture and you finding the vulnerabilities. And once you find the vulnerabilities, you want to identify the controls where you can mitigate these vulnerabilities. And I just gave one example. So you do a gap analysis and you find that there are some workstations that is running Windows 2000, for example. I'm just using that. Don't hold me to that. It's newer operating systems than that. But just say they're running Windows 2000 on a bunch of laptops and they haven't been patched in 2 years, right? So there are all kind of vulnerabilities there. That's a gap, right? Um, Another gap could be you have a server room that you don't have a key card or there's no lock on the door, so anybody can access your server room. That's a gap, right? So you got to find controls and put controls in place to be able to mitigate those gaps that you find. Does that make sense? Any questions on that? So, in essence, the true definition of what a gap analysis is really is a process. What it says here, it's the process that identifies how an organization's security systems deviate from those required or recommended by a framework. Right. So when we talk, press rewind, we go back and we talk about NIST. Right. We talk about the NIST framework. So this NIST framework is going to lay out the controls that you should put in place to protect, identify, respond, all those different functions we talked about. It's going to lay out the controls that you should put in place to mitigate those vulnerabilities. So now when you run a gap analysis, you are identifying how your organization's security system deviates from what was outlined in whatever framework you're using. Now, NIST is not the only framework. There are other frameworks out there, but NIST is like, like for example, basketball, right? You got all these different leagues. You got pro-am leagues, you got college, you got high school, but then you got the NBA, right? The NBA is the top. Those are the best in the world. So NIST is like the NBA of cybersecurity. When you talk about NIST, there is nothing bigger than this because, like I said, they write the frameworks and they write the standards. So um, get a chance, go check it out, look at this, some good information in there. So the second part of it is you're going to perform whenever you adopt a framework. So let's say you're going to use that NIST framework. So whenever you adopt the framework, one of the first things you're going to do is do that gap analysis, right? So let's say something comes down the pipe, you're a financial institution, and there's some new compliance regulations that come out that you have to, sorry about that, that you have to abide by. So whenever you implement that framework and you got to abide by it, you want to um, make sure that you conduct a gap analysis to find out where you're vulnerable at. And when you find those vulnerabilities, you want to put the controls in place to mitigate those. So, a summary of the gap analysis finding showing a number of recommended controls not implemented per function and category, plus risk to confidentiality, integrity, and availability from those missing controls, and target remediation date. So whenever you conduct a gap analysis, these are the things that you want to address and want to identify in that summary. Because a lot of times when you do these gap analysis and these summaries, you have to report this information back to, your bosses. You have a CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer. You might have a Chief Information Officer, the CTO, whoever, the executives that are overall responsible for the security posture. They're going to want a summary of what you find, right? So in that summary, once you do that gap analysis, remember the thing that we're looking for is we're looking for, based off of this framework, the controls that we didn't implement that they say we should, right? And then not only that, but the risk to our foundation, right? We said the foundation of cybersecurity is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So if I didn't implement these controls, what is the risk to confidentiality, integrity, and availability from those missing controls? And then you want to have a timeline or a date of when you're going to you expect to remediate these missing controls. In other words, when are you going to fix it? So you have a target date to say, these are the findings. I found that these controls are not implemented. These are the risk to confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and then we plan on having this remediated by such and such date. So you have to have all these things um, in the summary. And in the beginning, when I said like, remember when I said cybersecurity is like um, just saying like I'm a doctor, right? So in within cybersecurity, this could be like a specialty. That may be your thing where you go identify gaps in the security posture. That may be your lane where that's all you do. You go into a company and you do gap analysis. That is an industry within cybersecurity where you got individuals that's the function they perform. You got some people that perform audits, you know, you got some people that do gap analysis, you got some people that do penetration testing, so there are a lot of different careers that you can span or that you can spawn when it comes to cybersecurity. And you will see questions about gap analysis um, on the uh, CompTIA Security Plus exam. And usually they ask questions around really like when would you perform a gap analysis, right? So let's say you're preparing for an audit, or you have some new compliance requirements that come down the pipe. These are reasons why you would do a gap analysis and try to find out, or whenever you're implementing a new framework, that's really the number one reason um, that you do a gap analysis. And then there's a formal procedure of how you do it. There are scores, there are, the way you rate, how they did on the gap analysis report. And we'll get into that as we go a little bit further too. So this is kind of like really what you'll see, right? This is it doesn't have to look like this per se, but normally they contain this type of information. So for example, the identify function, right? So they were scored 10 out of 16. So that means they have some gaps there. So their asset management, they got a 4 out of 6. So so what this says, like if you look at the identify function, right? So if you look at asset management, the framework requires that they have 6 controls in place that remediate the asset management process. This gap analysis find that this company only has 4 in place, right? So now this is a risk levels to the triad. So the risk for confidentiality, integrity, and availability for asset management is not too high, but it's high enough where it probably should be, on your list to. It's not a 9 like here, but 6 is, that's something that should get your attention. So basically, it's saying that the risk levels are at a 6, and then they target Q4 to have all of this fixed, meaning that they'll go back instead of having the 4 controls for asset management, they'll have all 6, and then they'll meet the requirement. And then once that is fulfilled, these risk levels go down. Does that make sense to everybody? Got any questions on that? So, like you see the ones in red, when you talk about protection. So out of the 16 controls that's required according to the framework, they only have 8. Data security, out of the 8 required, they only have 3. So that means their confidentiality and their integrity is at risk. It's a 9. So that means that's a high probability that you're going to have some sort of an event because you don't have the proper controls in place to protect the data. So when your executives see this, this is going to get their attention. And then you have the target remediation date, which is Q1. So you're going to fix that pretty fast, right? You see the sixes, some sixes are Q4, and then you got some sixes that are Q3. So it's something that's, there's a gap there, there's a vulnerability there, but the risk of an event actually happening is not that great. It's high enough for you to make sure that you resolve it, but it's not like 9 where more than likely that's, you're going to have an event if you don't get this fixed. So this is kind of like what a gap analysis summary would look like. And as a cybersecurity professional, you have to understand what these mean and how to respond to it. You as a cybersecurity professional may get this list and you may be tasked with putting in controls to be able to mitigate these deficiencies, right? And then there's another thing called compensating controls. Um, Compensating controls is things of like you have a risk. There's a control that's recommended, but you're not don't have that control right now in place to be able to provide that security. But you have something else in place or that you can put in place right away that can provide the same level of security or protection or a higher level of protection. That's what they call compensating controls. And we'll get into that a little more too, but you'll see that on the cybersecurity exam when we talk about controls. Now, this is just an information. This is basically saying while some or all work involved in gap analysis could be performed by the internal security team, a gap analysis is likely to involve third party consultants. Frameworks and compliance requirements from regulations and legislations can be complex enough to require a specialist. Advice and feedback from an external party can alert the internal security team to oversights into new trends and changes in best practices. So back to my initial point, gap analysis could be your lane, right? As you see here, it says gap analysis is likely to involve a third-party consultant. So you as a cybersecurity professional, you get real good at doing gap analysis. That could be your lane. You start a cybersecurity firm where you specialize in doing gap analysis. So now you have a service or you provide a service to companies that you come in and do an assessment to find gaps based on certain frameworks. So you can, like I said, that NIST framework. So if you go back and become an expert on the NIST framework and all of the different functions and the controls, you become an expert on that, then you can become a consultant. So now anybody that implements the NIST framework, you can go in and do gap analysis. And this can, depending on the size of the company, this can be tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars that these companies pay to have this service done. Because if there isn't, like I said, if there's an event or you have some sort of data breach, it's going to cost. They're going to get fined and they're going to have some problems on their hands. Any questions on what we went over so far? Feel free to ask. Don't be shy. Does everything make sense so far? You still following? All right. Take silence as a good thing. Now, one of the key things when you talk about cybersecurity is access control, right? So when you talk about access control, you want to make sure that your systems meets the goal of the CIA triad. You want access controls in place so you can meet the goal of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, right? So access control governs how subjects principals may interact with objects, right? And those objects or those subjects, are the people, devices, could be computer, could be software packages, or any system that you have to grant access to your, coworkers or to your employees to be able to access these systems, right? So you want to have a robust access control in play so you can control who have access. So, for example, you're a financial institution, right? So if you're a financial institution and you got customer financial data, right? You got their credit card numbers, you got their account numbers, you got all their personal information. You don't want anyone, let's say a new employee that just came on that works in uh not accounting, let's just say they work in maintenance, somebody that wouldn't have no reason to be able to go look at that data, right? So you want to have controls in place because everybody's not honest. Let's take it for, let's be real. Some people get into a system and they just be exploring, clicking on stuff, looking to see what they can find, right? It may not be a malicious actor. You got internal employees to do that. So you really want to have a real robust access control program in place where you can control who you grant access to, when you grant access to, and why you give access to these individuals. And then we'll talk about it later on, but there's a concept when you talk about access control is the principle of least privilege. So you only want to give people access to what they need to do their job, no more, no less, right? So you don't want to, like I said, you don't want to give maintenance access to financial data because they don't need that to do their job. So you want to be careful about that. So the modern day access control systems, you'll hear this term a lot. It's called IAM, right? IAM stands for Identity and Access Management, right? Identity Access Management, and you'll hear that term a lot. IAM. Anytime you're talking about access control, that's the first thing that's going to pop up. IAM, Identity Access Management, and then there are four main processes when you talk about IAM. You got the identification, the authentication, the authorization, and then the accounting, right? So the identification piece is, your username, something that's unique to you as a user. It could be a device, it could be a process, but whatever the case, the identification is an account or an ID that uniquely represents the user. And in most cases, for us, it's a username, right? It's your username. So your username is your identification. And then the authentication piece of it is proving that a subject is who or what it claims to be when it attempts to access the resource. So authentication factor determines what sort of credential the subject can use. For example, people might be authenticated by providing a password. A computer system could be authenticated using a token, digital certificate. You have things now where you can use biometrics, where you can use a fingerprint, you can use a retina scan. It's so advanced now you can even use what they call your gait. So you can you can have an authentication method based on how you walk because everybody's walk is unique to them, right? So you can capture that and then you can have an authentication process that's based on that. And then even now you'll hear the term multi-factor authentication or MFA. You'll hear that a lot now because now, back in the day, all it required was a password. You just type in your password, you get authenticated, you got access. But now, with so many different breaches and so many different methods of breaking into systems, they have what they call multi-factor authentication, meaning that you have to have two forms of authentication. So you may see that on when you access your bank account. Like when I access my bank account, I put in my password. Once I put in my password, that's one form of authentication. But then it sends me a text with a code. So then I have to put in that code as a second form of authentication before I'm actually granted authorization, right? So that's what they call multi-factor authentication. And it's just basically more than one authentication method. So you go from an identification to the authentication, and then you're authorized, right? So based on the rights that you've been given, um, the authorization piece is going to enforce those rights. So let's say you're trying to access a printer. Once you identify and authenticate, the authorization is going to say, what rights do you have on this printer to be able to use it? And then accounting. It's a way to track the unauthorized uses of a resource. So usually there's logging. You usually have logging that you go back and review to look to see what resources were accessed or who been accessing it. And this is another part, like this is another lane in cybersecurity, right? You can just be an identity and access management expert because you talk about some of these large organizations. Think of Amazon. Think of how many employees Amazon has, right? So you can imagine their identity and access management uh, architecture has to be huge and requires maintenance and management because you have people coming and going. You have people that leave the company, you have new hires, and you have to be on top of that to be able to onboard and offboard. So IAM is a very important piece. That's access control. So think of it like this. Give you a real world example. So let's say you walk into a liquor store, right? You have to be 21 in order to purchase liquor or alcohol. So when you walk into the liquor store, um, the first thing they're going to do is when you're trying to purchase something is they're going to ask you for your ID, right? So that's the identification piece. You pull out your ID, they're going to look at it, they're going to confirm that that's you, right? And then they're going to confirm that you're of age, you're 21 and over based on the year, right? So then they've authenticated you. So they authenticated you and said, okay, you are who you say you are based on your ID. And then the information that's contained on your ID um, authenticates you. So now I'm authorizing you to be able to have access to all of this alcohol in here. So your identification gives you the kicks off the authentication, which then gives you the authorization. So another example, you log into your network, right? You put in your username, put in your password. That's your identification. It may or may not ask you to do multi-factor authentication, but once you go through that process, then you're authenticated. So you've ID'd yourself, and the system has authenticated you, saying, okay, you are who you say you are. And then the next phase of that is the authorization. So the authorization looks at the rights or the privileges that you have on this network. So you have certain privileges to access certain files, and certain files you may not be able to access. You may be able to access certain printers you may not be able to access. So that's based on the authorization. So after you identify, you are authenticated, then you're authorized to use whatever resources. And then to keep track of all who's using those resources, there's an accounting piece. So you want to always track authorized usage of a resource, you want to look at these logs. You want to see, are there any alerts that alerted you for unauthorized access? So you always want to have an accounting method um, of your IAM processes: identification, authentication, authorization, and accounting. Everybody cool with that? Any questions, comments, concerns? All right, you guys still with me, right? Be quiet. I don't hear anything. Hands up, something. All right, I'll take the quiet as you guys are getting it. Hopefully, don't feel free to ask questions. Like I like to be interactive. I like to um, talk back and forth, create some discussion. So if there's any of these concepts or any of these terms that we're covering, and you're not 100% sure, feel free to ask a question. Raise your hand, ask a question. We can talk about it. We can discuss it because my goal is to make sure you guys not only pass the test, but you have a real good understanding of the fundamentals of cybersecurity. And the only way I'm gonna know that is, through the interaction. So this is just a visual account of what we just discussed. Um, First step, the identification piece. You got the system owner confirm the user's identity and creates an account to represent the user. So this usually happens, when you first onboard. So when you first join a company, once HR looks at your social security card and your ID and they do all the things that they do, that's part of the identification process. And then when they're onboarding you, they create your user ID, right? A lot of times it's the first letter of your first name and your last name, or it could be a combination of your last name and first name, or it could be a combination of both. So um, you put in your security ID, you get an account created with the SID and the password. That's usually done by IT guys. And then once you create your password, they'll usually set you up a default password, and then you'll usually change it at some point. So once you do that, you authenticate it. So you put in your username, you put in your password, everything checks out because that account was created in his first step. So now you're authenticated. So the user authenticates by entering the credential and comparing it to the hash credential. And when they talk about hash credentials, because usually most organizations don't store passwords in the clear, they're hashed. And we'll get into the concept of hashing later on, but it's just basically a way of masking the password. So if you look at it, if you're able to, let's say, break into the password file or you get into the password database, you won't be able to make out what the passwords are because they're not in plain text, they're hashed. And then even with hashing, there's another concept called salting. And don't let me confuse you. Don't hold on too much to that because we're going to cover it later. But that's a process of how they store passwords. And then once you are authenticated, most devices, most files, and you really don't, you can't really see it with the naked eye. But once you build up your IT skills, you'll understand what an ACL is or access control list. This is a list that every file, every resource, or every object on the network has an access control list. And what that access control list does is you have an entry there, right? Your user ID is on that access control list and what rights you have or what can you perform on that file. Can you read? Can you write? Can you delete? Sometimes you can only read it. If you're not the file owner, they may only grant you read access. That way you can't change anything in the file. You can just read it, right? So that's your authorization. Your authorization based on the ACL is that you only have read privileges to this file, right? And then the access control list for the accounting piece has a audit log. So now you can view that log and then you can look and see all the user IDs that access that file. And then you start to notice that, these are from outside our organization. These are IDs that don't even fall in the, like I said, usually with the IDs, it'll be like the first name, last name. So now you see in your audit log that it's a naming convention that's different from all your other users. So that starts to bring some suspicion. So now you need to investigate to make sure that no one is um, unauthorized or no unauthorized people are accessing these files. So it's very important. And you have like it's not nowadays like back in the day, you may have to physically go look at the log and analyze the log and things of that sort. But now things are getting a little more sophisticated where you have um seam tools. You have tools that can ingest all these different logs and kind of make it give you a dashboard so it's a lot easier to read. So yeah, there are tools out there now that makes this a little bit easier. So the 4 steps in IAM, don't forget the IAM process, right? This is all what we call access management or access control. The fundamental of access control is IAM, identity and access management. And then within that, there are 4 main processes: identification, authentication, authorization, and accounting. And then it's just reiterating. So um, nothing to just be familiar, use those examples, identify yourself. Then you have the authentication method, which is usually your password, something of that sort, multi-factor. Authorization is saying, hey, according to this access list, you're authorized to do X, Y, and Z. And then the accounting piece of it. Any questions
Du-
on that?
Dwayne, did we get the questions answered that's in the chat?
Oh, I didn't even see the chat pop up. Let me get to the chat. Hold on. Sorry about that.
That's good. I'll go ahead and just read it out loud for you. The
Okay.
first question was, would PAM be used in different companies to store passwords, etc.?
You said you said
The privilege
Pam?
access management tool.
Yeah, I mean it would. That's kind of the fundamental. So yeah, I would say yes to that. You would see it in probably every, especially now, every organization is going to have some sort of mechanism to be able to control that password management. And even now, people are trying to even they got a new thing that's called password lists because you know the thing about passwords is, and I could be guilty of it myself, and I am a cybersecurity professional, but most most people use their pet names or they use their birthday or they use, something that can be easily deciphered. They don't use the uppercase, lowercase, um, special characters. So what companies do now is they have what they call password policies. So this is a policy that your IT people create. So it forces you to create a complex password. Um, Not only is it complex, but they may force you to change it every 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. They may also have it where you can't use the same password for 10 passwords. So if you set password A and then it comes 60 days and you have to change it, you can't reuse that same password for 10 iterations before you can use it again. So yeah, you would definitely see that at companies across the board because a lot of breaches come, by stealing credentials. Did that answer your question? I hope so. What was the next one?
Let's see, did we get the question answered regarding the risk register? So once a risk has been detected, then a risk registry can be created to document the different vulnerabilities.
Absolutely. That's part of the process. Um, once you identify that risk, you definitely want to document it because you want to not only do you want to document it, you want to you want to classify what that vulnerability is. Like how big of a risk is it? Is this something that we need to jump on right away, or is it a risk but it's a low chance that it can be exploited? So absolutely, you definitely, once those risks are identified, you absolutely want to document them, keep track of them. You want to document what that risk is. You even can document what it's going to take to resolve it, when it's going to be resolved, and what you did to resolve it. All that should be documented.
And that's it.
All right, good deal. Yeah, I keep my chat up so I can see your guys' questions.
I'll monitor it for you.
All right, cool. All right, I want to act up. There's another way we could do it. We'll skip this. This is just as you know, in CompTIA, there's a live lab. This is basically just getting you familiar with it. So we'll go over some labs as we start to go through these courses, and it kind of you guys can't do them per se. Usually with if you had seats within this CompTIA platform, then you will be able to actually go in here and do these labs. But we'll walk through some of them together just to kind of give you an idea of how you implement some of these things that we talked about. Now, this is really a big piece of it. Security controls. Security controls is really um, the gist or the thing that you're trying to put into place to be able to meet that CIA triad, that confidentiality, integrity, availability. You have to have controls in place. So information security or InfoSec and cybersecurity assurance is met by implementing security controls. By identifying basic security controls, you'll be better prepared to select and implement the most appropriate controls for a given scenario. You should also be able to describe how specific job roles and organizational structures can implement a comprehensive security program for organizations. So when we start talking about security controls, these are the things that we're trying to get you guys to learn. Um, so compare and contrast various types of security controls. I think that's one of the domains on the actual exam itself. And you have to know there are categories, and then are controls underneath those categories. And once you start to get into it, it'll make sense to you that they're really, I ain't gonna say self-explanatory, but they make sense when we start to talk about it. So when we talk about the security control categories, information and cybersecurity assurance usually takes place with an overall process of business risk management, right? So that's when we talked about. Remember the first time when we talked about you have to do the risk analysis, the gap analysis, your vulnerability scans. So that's all part of our prerequisite before you implement the security controls, right? So go back to when we talked about the framework, right? So the framework, what it does is it has all these different security controls in place that you should use in order to achieve confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So you as a cybersecurity professional want to go implement the right controls for the right scenario. So there are four different categories of security controls. You have the managerial controls. These are controls that give oversight to of the information system itself, right? So examples can include risk identification or a tool allowing the evaluation or selection of other security controls. And I'll give you a better explanation too as we start to dig in it. But just think managerial is kind of, I ain't gonna say self-explanatory, but it'll give you a hint, right? When you talk about um, types of controls, managerial is usually going to come from your managers or your examples, and they're going to, probably come up with some procedures or, some sort of things that they mandate that you guys do that everybody does. These are, managerial controls. Then you have the operational controls. These are the controls that's implemented, by the people. These could be your security guards, user awareness training programs. So anything that's implemented primarily by people is considered an operational control. Then you have the technical controls. These are controls that are implemented by some sort of software, right? Software, hardware, firmware, some sort of technical aspect or technical equipment is going to be used to in this category. So that contains like your firewalls, your antivirus softwares, your access control. All of those things are considered technical controls. And then you have your physical controls, um, security cameras, alarms, gateways, locks, lighting, um, bollards, that you put in front of a fence. A fence can be a physical control, a key card, you got a key card that you may have to swipe to get access to. Those are all considered physical controls. So make sure that you understand these, the managerial, operational, technical, and physical. These are definitely on the test. And the way they kind of put you in scenarios, they'll give you a scenario and they'll ask you which control type or control category would be used or what control type is being used. They may give you a scenario and they actually say what they did or what the control is. And you got to identify whether it was managerial, operational, technical, or physical. Those are the categories: managerial, operational, technical, and physical. Now, with the categories, under the categories, you have the functional types. So you have the categories, back up, you got the managerial, operational, technical, and physical. And the way I remembered this when I was taking a test, I just created an acronym called MOPT. And you can do your own, but for me, when I say MOPT, oh, okay, managerial M, operational O, physical, and then technical. So you can come up with a little acronym to help you remember managerial, operational, technical, and physical. So then underneath each of these categories, we go back to the functional type. So now you have different functional types. So um, a security control can be defined according to the goal or function it performs, right? So you have a control type called preventative, right? So what that does is that control, it wants to eliminate or reduce the likelihood that an attack can succeed. So basically, when you're doing something preventative, you want to prevent it from happening, right? So you got the preventative controls that you put in place before there's any type of event happening. So that could be a sign that say, like for example, I don't know if you guys ever logged on to like a government website or something like that, and it gives you this warning that say, this is the you're accessing the US government computer. Um, it's only used for certain reasons. Any type of access outside of that is illegal. And, whatever that warning message, that would be something that's preventative because it's giving you a message letting you know, hey, don't do nothing crazy because, you're going to be held accountable. So, a sign up or a banner that pops up on a computer, some sort of warning is considered preventative. Another type, like access control list that's configured on firewalls and file systems, um, are preventative type technical controls. Even though the firewall itself is a technical control, because remember we said the technical category is software related, hardware related, firmware. Those are all your physical, technical controls. So a detective, that's kind of self-explanatory. What detectives do? They investigate, crimes to figure out what happened. So a detective control, it may or may not prevent or deter access, but it'll help you identify and record an attempted or successful breach, right? So usually detective controls operate during an attack, right? A detective control is not after the fact, it's not before because that's preventative. So whenever your detective controls are in place, these are things that um, help you identify, record, monitor um, any type of attack that's actually going on, right? Going on live. You're using your detective skills to figure out what's happening. And then you have your corrective controls. Self-explanatory. Is to eliminate or reduce some sort of gap that you have or some sort of security policy violation. So you have a um, file system that was destroyed during an attack, right? So you have a corrective action that you have to take to fix that. That could be a good backup. That could be a corrective control because you have backups where um, the file system that was damaged, you can just restore from a backup and now you're back in business, right? So while most controls can be classified functionally as preventive, detective, and corrective, there's a couple of other categories as well. You have a directive. Those are control that enforces a rule of behavior, such as a policy, right? So you have a security policy, best practice, SOP. Any of those things are directives. Something that directs you how you should behave in this environment. And then you have a deterrent, right? A deterrent is a control that's trying to deter you from doing something, right? This again could be a sign, a warning. Like I said, the banner that pops up on the computer, that can be a deterrent, right? It's trying to deter people from like lighting, right? So if somebody's, you know, scoping out your warehouse, you may have bright lights that come on. That's a deterrent, right? Because you now you lit up the space, so now they can be seen. And then you have those compensating controls. Those compensating controls, the technical definition is the control is a substitute for a principal control as recommended by a security standard and affords the same or better level of protection, but uses a different methodology or technology. This can include using network segmentation so that only specific hosts can communicate with the critical legacy system that can no longer be patched, right? So you have, like, let's say some old computers that are not supported by the manufacturer anymore. So you're no longer getting updates for these security systems. So um, the control is you should be patching these systems so you mitigate these vulnerabilities. But you can't get the updates any longer because it's out of it's end of life. So you can create a compensating control. This in this example, they basically took these systems, took them off the main network and created their own little private network that very few people have access to. So what that does is it still meets the control because nobody can access, those systems because it's a own private network. It's the network has been segmented. You created a segmentation of the network and put these critical systems in there that you can't patch. So people from the outside really can't even access it. So it's giving you, it's meeting the criteria for the control, but it's actually giving you even a higher level of control. So that's what it says. The control is a substitute for a principal control as recommended by a security standard. So the control is the principal control is you should be patching these systems up, but you can't do it. So you've created a network segmentation so that only specific hosts can communicate with that legacy system. So you found another way. So in other words, compensating controls is another way of meeting the criteria for the initial control. Does that make sense? Any questions? All right. So make sure that you understand the categories, right? Managerial, operational, physical, technical. And then you got the functional types, the preventive, precedes an event and attempts to block it. Those are preventative controls. Detective controls operate during an event to identify the event. And then you got corrective, mitigates following an event. So after the event happened, you go back and put corrective controls to fix the things that allowed this event to happen in the first place. And then you have the directive, deterrent, and compensating controls. So make sure you guys are very familiar with these types because that's definitely on the test. You get quite a few questions about this. And they, like I said, they give you different scenarios and you got to determine if it was a detective control, was it a corrective, was it a managerial category? You got to, and I think if I'm not mistaken, it was like a drop down. So you really got to know these definitions. So go back and look at these when you're studying and at the end of this course, go back and review what we just covered. Because by the time you get to the end of it, you you don't want to forget the stuff that you learned in the beginning. So go over it, make sure that you understand it, you can recite it, recall it, you know how to use it, you know when it's used, and then you'll do very well on the test. You shouldn't have any problem.
Right, Dwayne, I just want to stop you there because I want to leave time for discussion.
Absolutely. All right, so let's talk, guys. Are you okay with what we covered so far? Is everybody good with that material? Does it make sense?